Okay, Rahila.
Assalamu alaikum and very good morning, everyone. I, Dr. Rahila Rahman Khan, on behalf of Department of Environmental Science, Integral University, Lucknow, welcome you all on World Environment Day 2021. This is a special day that was established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1972 at the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment and is celebrated every year on 5th June. It is a day which aims to stimulate worldwide awareness of the environment and to remind people that nature should not be taken for granted. It is celebrated across the globe to respect and acknowledge everything that the environment has given us and to take the pledge that we will protect it always. This year theme of World Environment Day 2021 is reimagine, recreate, restore, as this year marks the beginning of the United Nations decades on ecosystem restoration. Our guest for today is Dr. Indu K. Murthy, who is a principal research scientist in the Adaptation and Risk Analysis team at Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy, Bangalore. I'm delighted, ma'am, that you have joined us. With this, I request Professor M. A. Khalid, Dean Student Welfare and Head Department of Environmental Science, to give a welcome address.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahila, and a very warm welcome to all the participants, to my faculty member, colleagues, my students, and our very esteemed keynote speaker and my good friend, Dr. Indu Murthy. I'm really honored to tell more about her. In fact, I can deliver a talk on her, but anyhow, I'm limited to some few words. Dr. Indu Murthy is principal scientist leading adaptation and risk analysis vertical at Center for Study of Sciences, Technology and Policy. She was formerly a consultant scientist at the for Sustainable Technologies, Indian Institute of Science for more than 2 decades. Her major area of research and policy advocacy includes climate change, forest, and ecosystem services. She has focused her research on various dimensions of climate change, mitigation assessment for land use sectors, greenhouse gas emissions inventory for land use sectors, climate change vulnerability assessment, adaptation, and resilience to climate change, forest ecology, and citizen science. She is an expert for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for Greenhouse Gas Inventory Review Process, a member of the Commission on Ecosystem Management of IUCN, and a member of the Red Plus cell of the Government of Karnataka. She is the land use change and forestry expert involved in national communications of India in the United UNFCCC, and she has developed CDM and Red Plus projects in India and helped formulation of climate proofing and green growth strategies for many states. She is a forestry and climate change consultant to the United Nations, the World Bank, and other multilateral and bilateral agencies. She is a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports on greenhouse gas inventories, good practices guidelines, and so many. And lead author for Global Environment Outlook 6 and lead author for Geo6 Asia Pacific reports on land use. She has published extensively on climate change and forest ecology and in peer-reviewed journals, and also authored several newspapers, articles, and blogs. In addition to all above, I feel extremely happy to share that she worked on a common project of HSBC Earthwatch Climate Partnership at Sirsi, Karnataka, where she led her forestry team from Indian Institute of Sciences, Bangalore, with Earthwatch, where I was field director for India Regional Climate Center. So I was very fortunate to be with her for 5 years, and it's a very long association we have. So together we have trained, in fact, not only trained, we have transformed the minds and lives of more than 500 employees from HSBC, Syngenta, and so many organizations, who are very proudly telling themselves as climate champions. So we are privileged to have her with us today as keynote speaker for her talk on ecological restoration of forest ecosystem. So I would like to invite her, and without wasting time, already we have. So I want all the participants to get benefited from her. Over to you, Dr. Indu.
Thank you, Professor Khalid, and thank you, Dr. Rahila, for the introduction. It's indeed my privilege to be here on the invitation of a very good friend, Professor Khalid. And I think without wasting any time, of course, this is the era of the virtual meetings. So everybody understands the technical glitch. But still, the good thing is we are here and we are starting it now. So let's discuss the topic of the day: ecological restoration of forest ecosystems. Right. So I have a presentation on the same, so which is what I'm going to be talking about. So yes, I mean, why are we actually talking about restoration itself? As you know, all of us are kind of, have a very close linkage with nature, both the biotic and abiotic factors, which we call as an ecosystem. Now, our ecosystem consists of nature itself and our connections, our interconnections with the various organisms, the various plants and tree species, and the physical environment itself, which we call as the biosphere. So now, when you look at what is happening with the ecosystem, it's quite startling indeed. Every year, the world loses 10 million hectares of forest, which is an area equal to the size of the Republic of Korea or twice the size of Costa Rica. And if you look at the freshwater systems, approximately 30% of natural freshwater ecosystems have disappeared since 1970. And thirdly, 1/3 of the global fish stocks are overexploited. And ecosystem degradation is already affecting the well-being of at least 3.2 billion people, which is 40% of the world's population that we are talking about. A humongous number, a humongous impact is what we are leaving behind. And also, soil erosion and other forms of degradation are costing the world more than $6 trillion a year, which is a result of losses in food production and other ecosystem services. Now, these are quite startling and staggering numbers in itself. Now, moving on, when we look at, let's narrow down our focus to the country that we all live in. What do the forests look like in India? What is the extent of forest? Now, if you look at the total forest cover in India, it's about 21.67% of the geographical area. Now, the forest area in India is biennially monitored and reported by the Forest Survey of India in its reports called the India State of Forest. Okay. Now, these reports are published every 2 years, and the latest was published in 2019. Now, what does this say? It says that there are more than 170,000 villages which are located in the proximity of forests, and there's a lot of dependence of these people on the forest ecosystems. And according to that particular assessment, during that period, a decrease of about 741 square kilometer of forest cover, particularly in the tribal districts, is what's been reported. And the loss has been largely due to shifting cultivation, forest fires, people felling trees, natural calamities, of course, and what they call as anthropogenic pressure is nothing but human use, human pressure is what is termed as anthropogenic pressure, and a whole lot of developmental activities. There are lands converted, forest lands converted for developmental purposes. It's a necessary evil, but there are issues around those as well. Now, where all do we see the forests in India? This is something, much of it is familiar to everyone who is here. Most of our forests are in three huge pockets, which is the Northeast, Himalayas, and of course the Western Ghats. Now, the Western Ghats and the Himalayas are one of the biodiversity, global biodiversity hotspots as well, right? So there are a whole lot of endemic species, threatened species, species in the IUCN Red List that are there. Now, if you want to look at forest cover in your own state, people from UP, I put UP primarily because Integral University is part of Uttar Pradesh. Now, your forest area is not very large, although you're a huge state in itself. Well, that's physiographically, that's the way it is. It's not like people have completely cleared it, but that particular region supports not as much forest as you would see in rest of India, in other certain other parts of India. So this is how our forests look. And these forests are home to a whole lot of iconic species, wildlife species. If you are looking at the Sundarbans, you have the tigers. If you go up northeast and some other areas, you see the rhinos, and then you see this lion-tailed macaque. This is a monkey species which is endemic to the Western Ghats. And of course, elephants. Who doesn't like an elephant? Who doesn't love? See, we all make trips to go and see these beautiful species in their wilderness. But I think we are also doing a whole lot of damage to the habitat which is home to these species. So which means if they lose their homes, obviously more and more of wildlife and human conflict that we read about time and again, and possibly even local extinction of species in the short term, and maybe complete extinction as we go along. And also the forest, as many of you would have seen, is also something that people access on a day-to-day basis for a whole lot of things. Now, be it firewood, be it leaf, dry leaf, because people use it as a fuel in places. In the Western Ghats, people use this for what they call as mulching, which is nothing but they put it at the base of a tree like areca, that's your pan, right? Supari ka jo tree hota hai. So they place it at the base of it to retain the moisture during very high temperature periods. And of course, bamboo, canes, a whole lot of medicinal plants, a whole lot of other fruit species is something that people use for their day-to-day living. And there are a whole lot of other benefits, what we call as intangible. You can't really visualize them, but they are there. That without that, it's not going to be there. Now, that's what we call as ecosystem services. Now, this is the gamut of ecosystem services that forests offer, right from purification of air and water. In fact, in the Western Ghats, even in other places, as you know, in the Himalayas also, lot of the rivers have their origin in these forest regions. Now, if you lose the forest, you're losing your watersheds, you're losing your water sources as well. Now, forests offer purification, benefits to air and water. They generate and preserve soils. They aid in dispersal of seeds, because there are a whole lot of species that are there which are required. Pollination, right? So that's again because of you have adjoining forests that are there next to the croplands. Biodiversity is maintained, and you also have climate stabilization. I'll talk about climate stabilization shortly, but that's an important, service that we derive from the forest. And of course, a whole lot of jobs and economic value when it comes to, say, timber, non-timber, anything. I mean, a whole lot of produce that's actually extracted, sold, processed, marketed, which gives revenue to a particular region. So if you want to sum it up, biodiversity, carbon, when we say carbon, it's to do with climate change. As I said, I will explain that shortly. Watershed services, as I already talked about, rivers, soil conservation, recreational and cultural values. I mean, who doesn't like going into the forest for a nice trek, right? You want to have a relaxation. I mean, after this pandemic, people are waiting to pack their bags and head out to some, hill destinations or beaches, right? So that's the kind of beauty, aesthetic value that forests offer. And of course, high conservation values, because a whole lot of tree species, animal species are all housed in these forest ecosystems, and without which you might be losing them over time. So now, if you want to put a value to these ecosystems, because let's just see, people have tried to do that as well. Now, if you look at this number, half of the world's GDP is dependent on nature, which is enormous. And also, forests provide drinking water to 1/3 of the world's largest cities, and they support anywhere between 68 to 80% of amphibians, birds, and mammal species. And at least 2 billion people depend on the agricultural sector for their livelihoods. Now, I'm talking about agriculture when our topic is forest because there is a very close link. Pollinators, as I said, are important for agricultural production. Now, without the forests, we might even be losing the pollinators. So, which is why it's a very close web of life that we are talking about. And peatlands, or what we call as wetlands, they store nearly 30% of the global soil carbon. And don't ignore the trees that you come across in your own towns and cities. These can provide a reduction of about 0.5 to 2 degrees centigrade in summer maximum temperatures. So, I mean, in the hot sun, we are always looking for some shade to cool ourselves when we are out on the roads. Now, this is a very important service of the trees, which are the basic elements of forest ecosystems. So at least 60 million people are benefiting from such, trees and forest ecosystems in different parts of the world. Now, the answer to why restore is something that I've already covered. So just to kind of summarize, we need to restore lands which are degrading, which are losing trees over time, for biodiversity conservation, for food, fodder, medicines, and a whole lot of other benefits that we derive from the forest, habitat itself for that matter, aesthetic purposes, recreational purposes, for health purposes, for abatement of pollution, pollination, and of course, for addressing climate change and education and awareness. So all of these are good enough reasons for us to talk about forest restoration. Now, the question might come, where do we restore, right? And do you and I, as public, as citizens, can we play a role in this forest restoration? Now, the answer is yes. The point is, when we talk about forest restoration, generally, people have this notion that forest is where it is very thick, a whole lot of trees together. Yes, I mean, that's a classical definition of a forest. But now that land is maintained by the government. The state forest departments own these lands and they manage them on a regular basis. And a lot of these lands, which are termed as protected areas or sanctuaries, are a no-go area. When I say a no-go area, people can't visit, or even if you get permissions to visit sanctuaries, people do visit, but you're not allowed to do any activity within there, be it maintenance of what trees are there, be it planting new species. That is something the forest department is doing. In fact, I would like to say here that next to China, India is the one which is leading in the area that it afforests or which it plants, every year. About 1.3 million hectares or something is an average number over many years that India plants on a per annum basis. Now, that is something that forest departments are doing. But however, there are a whole lot of other lands also where we can do restoration, which is to do with farmlands or your cropland or agricultural land. When I say community lands, traditionally in the villages, there are some common lands that are there. Now, on these areas, or even lands owned by certain temples, there could be a whole lot of restoration activities that could be taken up. And of course, wastelands. What is termed as wasteland? Of course, on paper, there is quite a bit of area, but in reality, we may not actually have so much of area because a lot of it is encroached, or maybe there is some other development that's happened there. But we also have an option to restore in the towns and cities that each of us are living in. It could be in the residential areas, it could be in commercial complexes, institutional spaces, and of course roadside, railway, on the sides of the railway line. A whole lot of things, whole lot of areas that could potentially be restored. Now, there are certain principles one needs to keep in mind. I mean, why are we doing restoration? Because we are trying to get back a whole lot of the ecosystem services that trees offer, that forests offer. So basically, one needs to kind of keep in mind that we are looking at conserving the flora and fauna, which is to do with your animal and plant species. We are also looking for improving or enhancing the ecosystem services like water conservation, or you're preventing soil erosion. You also aim to reduce, say, pollution. It could be water pollution, soil pollution, atmospheric pollution, anything that we are looking for. And it could also be, some opportunities for tourism if you're looking at rural restoration close to villages. Some opportunities for tourism could be built around it, or for regulating the microclimate, or for improving the health, or even just for creating awareness. Now, the question is, when you restore, is it possible to get all of this together in one place? Maybe, and maybe not. So we have to be realistic about it. So whenever we are looking at a landscape restoration or a forest, we need to think long time. It's not a short span of time we are looking at. We need to also think big space. When I say big space, what I mean is some kind of a landscape approach, in the sense one is interconnected to the other. You can't do things in pockets, right? You need to treat your landscape as a mosaic of sites. So you're aiming at restoring functionality and productivity. But please remember, we are not trying to create original forest. Now, the reason I put this is because you can't create an original forest. What's taken several decades and millennia to come together, or some of the, primary forests that are there around the world, be it the Amazon, be it in the Northeast, or be it, some pockets in the Western Ghats, have taken several, years, multiple decades to be there. So obviously, we cannot create it within the short time span that we have a real forest. But what we can do is we mimic a forest. So you can't restore all the flora and fauna that is there in a real forest. What you can do is you can try to kind of restore the functions of some of these systems, which is what we try to do when we do land restoration. And also, one needs to kind of also balance the local needs and high-level priorities. Now, high-level priorities are to do with, say, conservation, or to do with climate change mitigation. But, local needs are extremely important, especially in the rural regions, rural areas. People depend on every piece of land for firewood, for fodder, or for grazing purposes, right? So we need to ensure that, the local needs are also met. Without having local buy-in, without having the participation of people, every restoration project will fail, because people have to see value in what is being restored. Otherwise, there is all reasons for a project to fail completely. So we need to kind of balance it, and also manage what we call as natural regrowth and plant nutrients. Now, I don't know if some of you are familiar that when you enclose an area and when you do not disturb it, right? You put a fence. For example, okay, residential sites, right? So some people fence off their residential sites, do nothing, right? When they actually level the land and leave it. But if when you go back, say after 6 months or after a rain or 2 rains, you will see that there is a whole lot of shrubbery that comes around in that site. There is a whole lot of thorny bushes or some trees, something that's come up there. Now that is natural regrowth. Sometimes you get some extremely valuable native species that regenerate when you enclose an area. Now, alternatively, there are some pockets of land where there is no great natural regrowth because the soil quality has been, it's the quality has completely degraded, or it's the fertility has been depleted over time. So possibly then you might need to plant new trees, which is what we call as afforestation. You plant new trees, right? Or you could also use trees to enhance food production, which is what is called as agroforestry. I'll talk about it in a bit again. Now, what are the two broad types of restoration that people talk about all around the world is, one is wide-scale restoration, which is the forest restoration that I talked about. Now, this, of course, is most likely possible only in sparsely populated areas where land use pressure is low and forests can grow more freely. Now, these could be in sanctuaries and protected areas, like I already said. But then the mosaic type restoration is the one where there is a lot of scope to bring in restoration activities. Now, these are smaller scale activities within the landscape where it's a mix of forest and non-forest land use. And it's obviously, population density would be higher in these areas because you have people living. When there is agriculture, obviously there are people living close to these landscapes. And they could be highly degraded. So you need to kind of plan restoration in these different pockets. So which is why it's a mosaic type of restoration. Now, what are the different options for restoration? So I talked about different land categories. I talked about two broad ways of which one could take up restoration. Now, how do we do it? So let's look at each land category. I'm not talking about all, but just a few land categories here. Now, the first one, of course, the most important are the forest land itself. Now, as you saw in the India State of Forest report, there is certain land, certain forest land that is deforested or that is, lost. So, which means to say people are overusing the land or encroaching or completely removing it, or it could be lost because of a huge, say maybe a road or a power line that's actually being laid there. Now that's one thing. But then alternatively, there is also something called degradation that happens in these forest systems. Now, when I say degradation, see, within the forest, you will have a whole lot of trees. It's very dense. But then over time, what you see is that in pockets here and there are a few trees which go missing because somebody illegally has harvested it. Now, which is called as degradation. The forest land from above, it still looks like a forest, but then on the ground, there is a whole lot of activity which is actually degrading the forest. So in such a case, people need to kind of opt for what they call as conservation and management, or regeneration, which is to plant new trees, as you see people are doing here, or you can afforest and reforest in these plantations, right? So you grow some kind of plantations. Now, this plantation could be a mixed species forestry, which is what is popularly advocated now. In the 80s, of course, people were looking at monocultures. People thought about, teak plantations, eucalyptus plantations, acacia plantations, pines in the Himalayas. But then over time, they realized that there are a whole lot of problems attached to monoculture plantations. So given that, then they thought, okay, let's kind of go in for native species and mixed species plantations. So which is what forest departments also take up these days. Now that's to do with the forest land. Now next, coming into farmlands or croplands, as you all know, if you go to the peri-urban, on the rural side, when you look at agricultural lands, in some parts of India, of course, it's acres and acres of an annual crop that you would see. But in certain parts of India, what you will see is that on the bund, on the edge of these farmlands, there are a row of tree species. Now, this is called agroforestry. It's a combination of agriculture and forestry. So you have multiple land use within a single patch. Now, people have been taking up agroforestry in a large way because it has its own set of benefits. Now, one benefit that comes to my mind is that, as you know, the climate is extremely variable in these decades. Even within our own lifespan, we are seeing that the monsoon onset gets delayed sometimes, or there is one good rain and then after that there is no rain, which is called as dry spell. So in agriculture, that's a very it plays a very adverse role. It can adversely impact agriculture because after sowing, after a certain period, the plants require water. Now, if people have irrigation, they can easily supply that water. But I don't know how many of you know that in India, we still have a significant area which is rain-fed. Now, when I say rain-fed, they don't have any alternate sources of irrigation. Rain is their source of irrigation. Now, if there is no good rain, if it's not evenly distributed, then in all likelihood, the farmer is going to lose his crop production, which means his income for the year. Now, what does he do? He's been going into debt for several years. Now, people are looking at agroforestry as an insurance, as something that can buffer their losses because it's a tree species. If they plant, let's say, a fruit yielding species, right? So they get income after a time period, of course, not immediately after they plant, but over years, he has that as an alternate income source. So agroforestry is something that's being widely looked at as some kind of an adaptation mechanism to climate variability. And it also helps in restoring land. Then, of course, is the wastelands. Now, this kind of land parcels is something that you will come across once you travel from one region to another, one city to another city, right? So now there are ways to restore and bring them back into some kind of forest patches like this, as you see here, right? You can halt land degradation in this way. You can prevent soil erosion. You can reclaim these wastelands. And of course, at the end of the day, once there is good growth and there is grass production, it also provides grass and fodder for livestock. So the benefits of restoration are multifold, other than restoring the land itself. And coming to the urban spaces, right? People think, okay, city means just concrete buildings. No, not anymore. There are a whole lot of cities around the world which are looking at urban spaces for land restoration, because they think urban greening can save species, it can cool the warming cities, and also aesthetic purposes. It can give happiness. Who doesn't like seeing a beautiful tree in bloom? Who doesn't like seeing greenery? And more cities like Singapore are looking at what they call as vertical farming, right? Or terrace farming. So they're looking at buildings as means for restoring. Of course, you can't grow a tree here, but then in some of the Middle East countries, on the terraces, you would see some trees also that are being grown in huge, massive concrete pots, because they don't have any land, of course, to grow forests, so to say. But even they are looking at restoration in some way. They want to add greenery to their own spaces because of the multitude of benefits that one can get from greening cities itself. Now, more and more talk is again coming around, how do we use nature itself for restoring a whole lot of other things. Now, there's something called nature-based solutions. Now, your nature-based solutions are to do with growing better trees, or how do you restore drinking water. Now, people are looking at nature-based solutions for restoring food security, for shoreline protection, mangroves. When you have good mangrove plantations, it kind of it serves as a wall when there is a flooding event, right? So that's the kind of benefits that people are looking at more and more around the world. Now, I'll specifically focus on restoration and climate change. Just one or two slides here, because that's something I've kind of worked on for quite some time. So, which is to do with growing forests for climate change. We call it as mitigation. Now, this is the picture of a typical forest, a very naively put one, but yeah, what you see in a forest is you have a whole lot of large trees, you have some mid-sized trees, and you will find a lot of ground vegetation, grasses, small young saplings, so on and so forth. Now, all of these are important when you look at restoration, when you look at climate change mitigation. Now, how does this happen? Now, in a typical forest, we are looking at what we call as 5 different carbon pools. Now, we call trees and forests as carbon sinks. Now, why do we call them as carbon sinks? If you think of it, it's our basic school science, which is to do with photosynthesis. Now, trees are the only species on the earth which can harvest carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? Now, as you know, climate change is all about greenhouse gas effect, which is emission of multiple greenhouse gases, and CO2 being one of the most dominant ones. Now, trees have the ability to capture this carbon dioxide and convert it into a form that's starch and other things, your process of photosynthesis. Now, that's why a living forest, a living tree, is a carbon sink. Now, all the different components in the forest ecosystem, including the soil underneath these trees, is a carbon pool, because when you have an intact forest, the soil underneath is also undisturbed. So obviously, it is also contributing to soil carbon sequestration, which is why, from a climate perspective, in addition to a whole lot of other strategies that everybody talks about, transportation, energy efficiency, waste management, then carbon sink is one important component of climate change mitigation, which is why restoration would also contribute to climate change mitigation. So it is very important from that particular perspective also. So just here's a 1-minute video on this entire issue of climate change. I'll just play it. And
the Earth's atmosphere is made up of gases, which trap heat from sun's rays, making it habitable for us, and the countless species on land and in water. In 650,000 years of the Earth's existence, the planet has gone through 7 cycles of cooling and warming. But currently, the Earth's atmosphere is warming 10 times faster than usual. Human activities, including agriculture, livestock management, transportation, urban cooling, deforestation, and industrialization, have led to the emission of carbon dioxide, CO2, and the greenhouse gases. These gases act as a blanket, absorbing heat and blocking it from escaping. This causes global warming and climate change. Climate change is also driven by erratic rainfall, warming of oceans, shrinking glaciers, extended dry spells, and heat waves. Climate change affects the entire ecosystem. On World Environment Day, let us pledge to restore the ecosystems and protect all forms of life.
okay, so that's one big reason as to why we should be, restoring. Now, let's look at the opportunities and benefits of restoration in numbers, right? Worldwide, globally. Now, the opportunity for restoration can be found on 2 billion hectares of land that is deforested and degraded worldwide. This is an area which is larger than South America. So that's the amount of land that could be restored. And restoration through agroforestry alone has the potential to increase food security for 1.3 billion people. So why shouldn't we do it? Restoration of forests and other watershed ecosystems can save water in the world's largest cities, equivalent to $890 million each year in water treatment costs. So that's an enormous cost saving that could happen if lands are restored. And of course, restoring 15% of lands that have been converted to other uses in the right places can prevent 60% of the projected extinction of species, which is very, very important again. Now, of course, climate change, you can get 1/3 of the mitigation could be achieved by 2030, and it can also help keep the warming or the increase in temperature below 2 degrees centigrade if we kind of restore the lands in the right places. So moving on, you also kind of have more benefits coming in when you're looking at restoration of coral reefs in Indonesia and Mesoamerica. That again could deliver 2.5 to 2.6 billion dollars in ecosystem services. That are the benefits that could be derived every year. And of course, up to $9 trillion benefit if restoration of 350 million hectares of degraded and deforested land is actually taken up. More important is for every dollar that is invested in restoration, up to $30 is going to be the economic benefit. So even if people are worried about the economics of restoration, it's going to be more beneficial by restoring land in the long run. And of course, ecosystem restoration contributes to achievement of all the 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, including poverty alleviation and zero hunger. That's something that could be achieved if land is restored in a timely manner and in the right places. Now, as I spoke, I did mention a whole lot of other benefits. So just to summarize, it can create rural jobs. It's an investment in sustainable growth. It definitely directly benefits the poor, and it could reduce the drudgery of women in South Asian countries, including India, who go to very long distances to collect the firewood. And of course, mitigation of climate change, sustaining biodiversity are the other global benefits or even local benefits one can derive from restoration. So I think now is the time for all of us to start thinking green, taking small steps towards creating a much greener world which is what is going to help us all survive as we move into the future. So thank you very much. And as it was mentioned during the opening remarks, this is the year, this is the day we are seeing the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And it's a call for each and every one of us to do our bit. Wherever we are, let's do what we can to have a greener earth so we can breathe easy, live happily, and also leave behind a good future for the generations to come. Thank you very much.
Rahila. Dr. Rahila. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Rahila.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. I must say that your lecture was very informative. It was of great importance, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And as ecosystem restoration is the need of the hour. Okay, now it is the time for announcement of winners of online quiz competition. So the third position is acquired by acquired by Miss Aisha Akhtar, pursuing BPTH first year. Second position is acquired by Priya Gupta, pursuing BSc Biotech second year. And first position goes to Kuddisia Khan, pursuing BPTH first year. Now I request Dr. Saima to give the vote of thanks.
Good morning, all of you. I, Dr. Syed Saima, on behalf of Department of Environmental Science, Integral University, Lucknow, deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks. We are grateful to our Honorable Chancellor, Integral University, Professor Syed Wasim Akhtar Sir, for allowing us to observe World Environmental Day 21 and being a source of inspiration. I thank our esteemed guest, Dr. Indu Kemurthy, who despite of her busy schedule has found time to grace the webinar, enlightening us about the ecosystem and sharing her experience about restoration and climate change. I extend my thanks to respected Vice Chancellor, Integral University, Lucknow, Professor Javed Masarat Sir, for his unstinted support. My heartfelt thanks to the Head Department of Environmental Science, Professor M.A. Khalid Sir, for his guidance and encouragement. I owe special gratitude to the Faculty of Environmental Science Department who have worked hard to ensure that this webinar becomes a memorable success. I thank all the distinguished invitees who have joined us. Last but not the least, I thank to our students. Once again, I thank you all for your kind attention and patience. Thank you.
So, last word after a elaborate thanks. Thank you so much, Indu, for being with us, and thanks to all my dear colleagues, my faculty members, for working hard towards it. I apologize for the delay. That is because of Google, not because of us. So we look forward to have you with us, Indu, again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Most welcome. It was my pleasure. Have a good day and stay safe, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.